Welcome everybody, my name is Paul Mitchell and I'm delighted today to welcome Professor Matt Costa to this interview series around launching the Hip Fracture Registry Toolbox. Professor Costa is going to talk on the subject of building the case for change, and whether that's at the national level or building a case for change at the local level in one's own hospital. Professor Costa is Professor of Orthopaedic Trauma at the University of Oxford. He's currently the chair of the Fragility Fracture Network UK Committee and co-chair of the FFN Hip Fracture Audit Specialist Group. So welcome, Matt. Thanks very much for your time.
Hi, Paul.
Great. So my first question to you, Matt, is with regard to building a case for change, and I say this is whether at the national level or the local level, in this Hip Fracture Registry Toolbox developed by the Asia Pacific Fragility Fracture Alliance in collaboration with your team at the FFN, we articulated a kind of why, how, what approach. So what do I mean by that? And so again, at the national level or the local level, why establish a national hip fracture registry or why participate in it? How can a national hip fracture registry be established or how could you participate locally? And what specific tasks need to be put in place to establish a registry at the national level or again in the hospitals in Oxford? So based on your experience with the well-established UK NHFD and your observations of registry implementation by colleagues in other countries, what are your thoughts on those three big questions?
Well, thanks, Paul. Wow, that's yeah, it's a big topic. I guess the why for us in the UK was pretty clear. It's our performance in terms of looking after patients with fragility fractures in general and hip fractures in particular was appalling. Essentially, we had a whole series of reports over many years telling us quite specifically how bad we were at looking after these older, frailer patients in our populations. So what do I mean by bad? Well, our mortality figures, our 30-day mortality was around 10%. So 1 in 10 of all patients with a hip fracture treated in the UK 10 or 15 years ago were dying within 30 days of their injury. And other countries, notably in Scandinavia, just over the water from us, they had a hip fracture mortality rate of about half that. So frankly, most of us were embarrassed. And the worst thing about it was we knew about that data for a long time and nothing had changed over a long period of time. So we knew we were bad and nothing had happened to change that. And we could spend all day talking about why that was and why we were so bad in the first place and why we didn't change. But for the purposes of this sort of conversation, I think that was the real driving force for most of us to get behind the hip fracture registry movement in the UK, was to try and change that outcome. In terms of how we went about doing that, I think the single most important thing, the thing I'd always sort of hark back to really, was the coalition of people you need to pull together to create the registry. So it's fine for one group of clinicians, usually, for instance, orthopaedic surgeons like myself, to go to managers and policymakers at a local and national level and say, oh, we need a registry. We need to record data so we know how we're doing in terms of looking after these patients. But they hear these requests all the time from different specialty groups every day. And so it's very easy for them to ignore that. But if you've got a coalition of people all going at the same time with the same message, that's very difficult to ignore. And again, that's true locally if it's your colleagues in orthopedics and anaesthesia and nursing and physiotherapy, all going to the same policymakers, the same managers to say, we need to change something. That's difficult for them to ignore. And similarly, if you have representatives of the big specialty groups at a national level and you're approaching national policy makers, so politicians and Whitehall people in the UK, these are the public servants who set the policies rolling, then if you've got a whole group of people with a different background, then it's very difficult for them to ignore. And the final piece in the jigsaw was to mobilise the patient voice to support this movement as well. And that's not entirely straightforward, because the average age of a patient in the UK with a hip fracture is 84. So actually mobilising that group of patients, literally mobilising them, is not always straightforward after a hip fracture. So getting their carers and their relatives, as well as their own voice, heard is hugely important. And then if you've got the public as well as the clinical staff telling the policymakers that we need a registry, then it's very, very difficult for them to ignore that. Once you've got that coalition of opinion and you've got the ear of the policymakers, you then need a plan, of course. You need an implementation plan. And again, we could spend all day talking about what you need to do that. But the fundamentals are you need a data set, a certain amount of information you want to collect, and then you need a way of collecting that data. And then the final piece, and perhaps the most important, is a way of feeding that back to the clinicians and to the patients so they know what's happening on the ground and can change practice according to the data that's given back to them.
Something I think you've said, Matt, is whether at the local level or at the national level, speaking with policymakers or hospital leadership with a unified voice across all specialities is really critical to achieve success. So then to think beyond the UK experience, you know, we know well that there is incredible diversity of the structure and resourcing of health systems throughout the world. With the FERMAT study that you have led in Oxford, you're very well aware of this. So given that incredible diversity of structure and resourcing, you know, based on that UK experience that you have lived, what advice could you offer colleagues elsewhere in the world regarding what are the must-do actions when it comes to building this case for change, again, nationally or locally?
Yeah, so I think that the basics of what anyone needs to do to pull together a registry for their country are the same wherever you are, and they're the things you talked about in the toolkit, and that we've talked about sort of previously. They're, you know, having a coalition of people, a simple data set, and a way to feed that back to the people involved in the care of the patient. So those fundamentals don't change no matter what the system. What we found in the UK is that you need specific data to actually change practice, and that data needs to be important for patients' outcome. It needs to be linked to their outcome. So there's no point in collecting data numbers for the sake of it. We've got to be numbers that represent something important to patients. So a very obvious one is mortality, is death. So everyone understands what that is, and that it's not generally a good thing to happen. So feeding back mortality rates to centres and having a system to do that is very important. But you need to link that to something you can change, because you might say, well, there's nothing I can do about that. But if you know that, for example, time to surgery, the time between admission to hospital and having surgery influences the rate of people dying afterwards, the theory being that the quicker you operate, the better people do, because they can get back on their feet quicker and get mobile and so on. Then if you can link those two bits of data, you have a much more powerful tool for changing practice. If you say, if you reduce mortality, if you can operate within 36 or 48 hours of the patient coming to hospital, that means that the clinicians on the ground have something to aim at. They can actually focus on improving their time to surgery as a way of reducing mortality. So what am I saying? Well, it's really about having quality standards, standards of process of delivery of care that you can link to the outcome for patients. And why is that so important? Well, because the standards may be different in different countries. So you've alluded to the fact that different healthcare systems have both different priorities and different funding levels, as well as different structures. So having a quality standard uniformly across all healthcare systems makes no sense. So for example, thinking about time to surgery, if your patients come directly from home to the hospital after they've broken their hip, as happens pretty much every time in the UK, because the patient can't move and it's terribly painful, so they call an ambulance and they come to hospital. So they're arriving in a very uniform way. Then having a time from admission to the hospital to the operating theatre makes a lot of sense as a standard to aspire to. However, if your patient spends 7 days at home being looked after by their family before they go to hospital, the time from admission to surgery doesn't matter, because you're already 7 days down the line. So that quality standard in a country where care pathways are very different makes no sense. And that's what really needs to be judged locally, of what are the standards of care, what data do you need to collect to drive change in your specific healthcare system for your population, and what will convince your colleagues to change their practice. And so picking the right quality standards for your country is very important. Packaging the data up to persuade politicians and policymakers to change practice, to put the money in essentially to create registries, is hugely important. And having bespoke quality standards, some things that you know that your healthcare system can and should deliver, is hugely powerful in changing practice. Because it's fine to say, well, in the UK, here's some data that shows this. But if you've got data locally that can show that, it's much more powerful at convincing people to change what they do. So that was a long answer, Paul, but these are really big sort of topics.
Absolutely. And again, maybe thinking, at the local level, out with all of your academic pursuits, you are an operating orthopedic surgeon. So thinking about the utility of the NHFD data, which provides you with a dashboard of measurements against the various national standards, how useful, again, bringing it back to this, building the case for the change within the hospitals in Oxford, has been having that data in pretty much real time, that as a multidisciplinary team in the Radcliffe, you can get together, analyse what you're doing, analyse what's going really well and what isn't. How important has that been to drive change locally?
No, hugely important. And the quicker you get the data back, the quicker you get the feedback, and the more accessible that feedback, the more powerful it is to change practice. So as you've alluded to, we now have essentially pretty much real-time data in the UK to look at. So when we have our multidisciplinary fragility fracture meetings, where all of the team involved in looking after patients get together every month to review the data, we can look at the last month's data in real time. So we say how quickly patients were admitted, how quickly they had surgery, how quickly they were mobilised, whether they all had a falls assessment, and we can look back on the data from just the previous 30 days. And that's incredibly powerful, because when we see outliers, one patient here has took 5 days to have their surgery, people remember that case. That's not a number, that's an individual patient that we looked after, or in this case didn't look after very well. And so that's incredibly powerful motivation for people to say, well, we're not just need to improve in this area, we need to improve because Mrs. So-and-so would have done much better if we'd actually got our finger out and sorted out her care better than we have. So the way the data is fed back to people, the accessibility of that data is important, but having it in real time is a real next step sort of driver for changing practice.
Well, thank you. Those are really useful practical insights at the local and national level. So just to conclude our short interview here, with the joyous benefit of hindsight, whether nationally with the whole programme of establishment of NHFD, when you look at what other colleagues are doing in the FFN Hip Fracture Audit Special Interest Group, what do you think we could have done better, or what could we have done differently?
Well, I mean, it's always things you could improve upon. I think and this isn't me, this is my sort of senior colleagues before me that helped set up the Registry in the UK, but a lot of things went well. So the coalition worked, the momentum, the drive to get the policymakers to change practice and liberate the money to do so, and then implementing that were huge success stories. So, you don't want to be too critical. I guess the truth of the matter is, though, that when we started, there wasn't that much data around from outside of the UK to help us establish the registry, which is why it's so important. For instance, the toolkit is very important because people can learn from mistakes from elsewhere. I think if we were starting again, the quality standards that we used to judge the quality of care for patients were essentially made up. But there were some things we had a little bit of evidence for that improved outcomes, but I think some of them are just best guess of firstly what could be collected and whether that would have a positive benefit. And it's really taken us, 15 years really to collect data to show that actually improving the process of patients' care actually improves their quality of life, as well as reducing their death rate. Actually, they feel better and their life is better if you look after them better, and certain standards drive that improvement in quality of life more than others. So I think concentrating on getting the right standards and providing evidence for the right standards earlier and quicker and better would probably be the key thing I change. But that's criticism of my background of what is a great success story. So mortality in the UK has fallen from over 10% to now around 6% since the registry started. And I don't think that's coincidence. There's quite strong evidence now that the registry itself was a driver for that change and that improvement in patients' outcome.
Well, look, Professor Costa, that's been some really useful insights. I hope that's going to help colleagues elsewhere in the world and stimulate them on their journeys. And furthermore, the Hip Fracture Registry Toolbox that's been this collaborative effort between APFA and the FFN, we hope that's a distillation so that other colleagues can avoid some of the pitfalls that we all experienced and expedite implementation of registries in their country. So Matt, thanks once again for your time.
Thanks very much, Bob.